privilege to be on this panel with distinguished people who will introduce themselves to you before they start speaking. I want to introduce Dr. Paul Mills, who is a professor at UCSD Medical School. Thanks to him, I also have a faculty position at UCSD Medical School. Paul is also the director for research at the Chopra Foundation. And thanks to him and many other colleagues, we've been very fortunate in the last 5 years or so, getting a lot of attention in peer-reviewed journals on the research that occurs under Paul's guidance, with a little participation from me. And I'll just stop there by saying that we recently had a paper published on non-dual awareness, or people moving in the direction of non-dual awareness, and how that transformed their well-being, physical well-being, and all aspects of well-being. Just one comment before Judith speaks. Although it's not the topic right now, the topic right now is non-dual awareness and well-being. But in the same process, we've been looking at gene expression, we've been looking at the brain, and we've had papers now published in Nature and other places where this experience 1 week that we call self-directed biological transformation, SBTI initiative, self-directed. We've seen amazing results in gene expression. All the genes that cause self-regulation, healing, homeostasis, they go up some 17-fold over baseline. All the genes that cause inappropriate inflammation go down very significantly. Telomerase, the enzyme that regulates the length of telomeres, goes up in some cases by 40%. So we are seeing some very dramatic effects at the genetic level and also in the brain.
Thank you, Deepak. Yes, my name is Judith Blackstone. How's the sound on this? Good? Good. I teach a series of practices that I call the realization process that can very effectively lead us to experience ourselves, to uncover a very, very subtle ground of our being that I'm calling non-dual awareness or fundamental consciousness in this work, fundamental consciousness. We experience this, when we attune to it, we experience it pervading our whole body. Right? And at the same time, we experience this very, very subtle consciousness pervading our body and environment at the same time. This has tremendous relevance for our personal well-being, because what it means is that in order to experience the oneness that we're calling non-duality, we also have to experience our internal wholeness. We actually experience this expanse of very subtle fundamental consciousness as a transparency pervading everything that we perceive, so that everything we perceive seems both empty and solid at the same time. And at the same time, we experience it pervading our whole body. Now, pervading our whole body, fundamental consciousness, is experienced as permeability, as openness. So that internal contact with ourselves, that being in the whole body, inhabiting the whole body as this very subtle and at the same time, it's openness to the environment. That means that we do not eradicate ourselves, we deepen all of our human capacities as we open to the environment. For example, if we inhabit our chest, right? It's really quite simple. If we live within the internal space of our chest, this present moment will be experienced inside our chest and outside at the same time. That created artificial protective barrier that we've all made from early childhood between inner and outer, between I and thou, falls away. It's there as a permeable boundary. The internal contact with ourself makes for a sense of our individual wholeness, but at the same time, it's permeable and responsive to the environment. So living inside our chest, our love flows more easily. We get our true responsiveness to other human beings, to other people. So far from being a zombie-like state, it's the real depth of our humanity that becomes ignited and deepened, opened, as we know ourselves as fundamental consciousness. Do I have a couple more minutes? You keep me good. They said 7 minutes. I have no idea. So we have that internal depth, and at the same time, we have openness as fundamental consciousness. Now, we also have internal wholeness, right? Because this dimension of ourselves, once we open to it, once we attune to it, it pervades everywhere in our body at once. And I still find it extremely interesting that to be in the body is to be in connection with ourself, with our love, with our understanding, with our sense of power, of personal strength, with our ability to experience pleasure, and with the shining forth of our perception, the clarity of our perception. So as a wholeness, it means that we are thinking and feeling, responding, and acting as a whole. We touch as a whole being. We see as a whole being. And in doing that, we get the whole picture, right? If we look at the rug, we get the texture of the rug, we get the form, we get the cognition of the rug, all at once, right? So this is our internal wholeness at the same time as our oneness with everything else. I was going to mention one more thing. I have a half minute. Authenticity, right? There's a very interesting thing about this ground. I'm going to call it the ground of being, right? Fundamental consciousness. It feels like who we really are. It comes with the impact of authenticity. And in that wholeness and in the spontaneity of our responsiveness to the world, there is authenticity. But there's even just a feeling, oh, yes, finally, all those masks and adjustments and protections that I've made all my life have, little by little at least, fallen away. And here I am feeling like who I really am. And here I am perceiving the world as close to how it actually is, right? So we know that there's always that kind of learned template of the world. We're never entirely perceiving in an objective way. Our experience is always subjective, but that subjectivity becomes cleaner and cleaner and cleaner until we have more and more of a sense of life being just as it is in the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Before we
If we have time at the end, maybe you can say a few words about your process. Okay?
Good. And I wanted to add that, getting back to what I mentioned at the beginning, which was the inspiration for this panel, if you listen to what Judith just described, and if you're familiar with the literature in psychology and psychiatry, as far as human well-being, you won't read anything like that in the literature in the biomedicine. And this is what we're endeavoring to do with our work together as a collaboration, is to begin to raise these points and to advance them to help improve and unfold this capacity as we know it. Thank you. Saran.
Okay, so my name is Oren Josipovic, and I'm at NYU. At the Langone Medical Center and also at the psychology department at School of Arts and Sciences. And my main interest is in researching non-dual awareness, researching the nature of consciousness, what is fundamental aspect of our consciousness, and how it relates to our experience. In other words, how it affects our experience. So one way that experience of non-duality has been described is by saying that it's simultaneous transcendence and immanence. That is, this awareness...
Can everyone hear, Saran? Right?
Okay, so how about this? All right, thanks. So
simultaneous transcendence and immanence,
right? So,
in case you missed it.
All right. So it is transcendent because this level of our consciousness is not affected by experience. It doesn't change whether you have very upsetting and a lot of experience, or if you have a minimal amount of experience and you're extremely quiet and focused in your meditation. That level of awareness is not itself fundamentally affected by the amount of experience or type of experience that we're having. At the same time, when it is stabilized, the people report that they experience as if everything is made out of that awareness. So all the things in that you're experiencing also have as their signature the basic property of this level of our consciousness. So we can call these properties or dimensions by different names, but just to keep it simple here, like being, it's cognizant, it's blissful, and it's unified as a unitary presence, which in some traditions is a self, right? But it's not a self in a constructed sense that our ordinary self is. So when we look at, in terms of experiments that I've done some fMRI studies, we have done some MEG data, we have even done some intracranial data on the patients who have epileptic seizures. And now at Nonduality Institute, which is a little place we have upstate, we can do the hyperscanning of 2 individuals as they are arriving into non-dual awareness at the same time. What we can see? So first thing that we see is that relatively rigid division between what's inside me and what is about me, and what is outside me, what's about other, or what's about not me or object, it starts to relax. So in the brain, we think that very strong division is mirrored in the dynamics of the brain organization into intrinsic and extrinsic networks. Brain is spontaneously organized in large networks, and these large networks are usually anti-correlated. When one is more active, the other one is less active. So even if you're not doing anything, just lying down and resting, they spontaneously oscillate every 10, 20 seconds. But when we find ourselves in non-dual awareness, or people who have been able to do that in the scanner, these 2 networks become more functionally integrated. And this is important because when people who research difference between unconscious and conscious states look at the brain, what they find is that the modularity, that is the ability of different parts of the brain to do different things and keep doing them separately from other things, that is, the brain is like a mosaic, right, fragmented in little things. That fragmentation of the brain, which is characteristic of unconsciousness, decreases when you become conscious, right? And brain becomes more unitary and more organized. Non-duality, even more than that. Even the fragmentation that we ordinarily experience in our awake consciousness, that also decreases. How much time I have? So, 2 minutes. Okay. So, something that many of you probably know, if you find yourself in non-duality, your perception gets more accurate. And when we look at the brain, one thing that, well, let's be honest, one thing that we would like to see a lot, but we're having a little difficulty tweaking the experiments just to detect it exactly, is that the top-down prediction that the brain does ordinarily, right? So ordinarily, you're sitting here in this room, the brain basically is saying, I know this is a room, I've experienced it, I have this memory, and I'm going to now just deal with my prediction and not so much with what I'm actually receiving as an input or as an experience itself. So we essentially ordinarily live in kind of a conceptual construct of ourselves and the world, which brain uses to kind of save energy and time. And it just goes, okay, I know this, right? That's that thing, I know it, I know myself, I'm like this, whatever. When that relaxes, we think that some of the top-down signal that we see in the brain is going to decrease. And the other thing that we see is that the bottom-up signal shifts. It becomes earlier, you notice things earlier, and you notice them more vividly. So that the shift is in a, let's say, so-called 100 millisecond signature in the MEG or N170. In EEG, you see that shift towards forward, and also amplitude is increasing. Because this is a most fundamental aspect of who we are, some people have termed it minimal phenomenal experience, because it's the least amount that you can experience, in the sense that there is something, if you isolate it, let's say in the meditations where you quiet your mind down completely, everything stops, and when you pass through the kind of unconscious state, then you are on the other side where there is just awareness. There's nothing else. You can say, some people have called it minimal phenomenal experience, because there is something it is like for you to experience this, right? So it is you who is aware. So what we see is that there is a network in the brain having to do with the precuneus, and a particular change in the relationship that how precuneus relates to prefrontal areas, that seems to be in a kind of like a signature, or I think it's a signature of this state. And because it's fundamental, we think that it will, just as Deepak and Paul and Judith have been saying, it does reorganize who we are. From a very deep level, from the most fundamental level of ourselves, it reorganizes things. So then even if you just approach this non-duality, you can have an effect. And we see this even in a situation where it's you would never believe you would see it in. With the patients who have intractable epilepsy, where they have seizures for several times every day, they're waiting for surgery, they have implanted electrodes, they have never meditated or done anything like that. We teach them very simple love and compassion meditation, which does introduce non-duality through kind of opening of the heart, right? As many of these techniques do. And what we see is that interictal hypersynchronization, it's a technical term, what means is that even when they're not having seizures, the brain shows a diseased pattern of hypersynchrony occasionally, which then will become a seizure. That interictal hypersynchronization decreases immediately after they do love and compassion meditation. So this, even though non-dual awareness is highly mystical, actually it's a fundamental part of ourselves and can have a great applications for health.
I have one question and a comment. So that was very good. Thank you, Zoran. About 10 years ago, at one of our retreats, we do these retreats twice a year, week-long retreats of pretty intense meditation, contemplative self-inquiry, transcendence. And people have glimpses of this experience, non-dual awareness. So we created a protocol where we took some people who were emotionally and spiritually bonded, say husband and wife, mother and son, significant other. We took them through these experiences, and then with the help of Joanna Standish in Washington University, and at that time Marilyn Schlitz at Noetic Sciences, we did the following experiment. We separate the two of you, Judith and you are separate. You put them in a Faraday chamber so there's no signal going in or out. And then we do an evoked potential. We take a flashlight and do an evoked potential, see the response in the brain. And to our surprise, both brains responded simultaneously, even though people were in separate locations, just by doing that. Now, it was a very limited study. We had great difficulty funding it. The technology was not that good 10 years ago. But we finally did get an abstract published. And there was a person in Mexico, Zyler Baum, who since then has either disappeared or died, because I went to meet him and he no longer exists, but in this form anyway. But he had done the similar experiment and published it. Are you aware of any other similar experiments, or do you think it's worth actually doing this? Because, see, if I have the evoked potential and you have it, it doesn't matter where you are. You could be in New York and I could be on the moon, and we are still in the same non-local space. That would be an amazingly dramatic proof of non-local correlation in this fundamental awareness. Any comments?
Right. So that is a great experiment. I've heard about that experiment, and one of the ideas that we had with getting an EEG system for hypersyncing, recording two individuals at the same time is that we can record two individuals in the same space, and then we can have the same system here in California. We are out on the East Coast. Woodstock, New York, the land of aging hippies. Sorry, I had to say that. So yes, all of us. So then, if we have a similar system here and similar system there, we can test this.
So let's collaborate on that, because we have many subjects who are having these experiences. I think if we collaborate on that and Paul can lead that, it would be something really worthwhile.
We will do it.
Okay.
And
wait, right till the end. Let's finish, and then we'll have your question.
So a couple things before we proceed with Tiffany. So regarding what you're saying, our first collaboration, we've been invited to write an article on non-dual awareness and well-being for one of the biomedical journals, which we're going to do as a next step. And I also want to add that Deepak had asked me initially to provide a definition of non-dual awareness before we launched the session. And I'm going to do so now, although these are always very relativistic. I'm going to define it in terms of the theme of our interest, in terms of the research, but also in terms of what Zoran and Judith said. So the one I would use at the moment that's relevant to what we're trying to do is non-separation. And why is that relevant? Because those of you who know either yourself or when individuals are not in a state of well-being, particularly depression, anxiety, highly stressed, what is this? What is the experience? It's an exaggerated sense of separation. Particularly in depression, a person's sense of self and life just contracts immensely. And what Judith was clearly describing was the complete opposite of that. It's a state of oneness. It's a state of non-separation. The knower, the known, and the process of knowing are intimately understood and known as one. There's no more separation. There's no more not being oneself and the environment simultaneously.
And that experience then slowly deepens into what Zoran was saying, non-phenomenal, or what we call non-symbolic awareness, where you realize that even this microphone is actually a symbolic you. You know, everything shows, whatever you see is you represented as a symbol. But it's you. There's nothing other. And you is not the body-mind. You're the awareness in which the body-mind and the microphone are modified forms of the same non-stuff. Okay?
We can say it like that. It's lovely to say it like that here, just as long as we know that we're talking about experience that we can have, right? How we experience our consciousness, right? And as long as we're not claiming that, without proof that that's how the universe works. We all hope that's how the universe works, but we need some, scientific data, scientific proof of the physics of it.
Agreed. Well, it'll be part of the next steps. So actually, at my institution, at California Institute for Human Science, we have a Faraday cage. And it's just down the street from you. So a 3,000-pound copper room that X's out the noise from the electrical systems and anything else with a stainless steel mesh so that we can actually even X out the 60 hertz. So we can get some clean data using it and run that experiment that you guys were just speaking of. So a promise. So I'm Tiffany Barsotti, and I'm a reverend. I operate in a private practice, spiritual and medical intuition as a counselor. And I kind of came into this path reluctantly. I had the so-called gifts of being clairvoyant, clairsentient, claircognizant, and even had psychokinetic abilities as a child, but I found it very torturous. So it took me a long time to sort of wake up to the path that, okay, I'll be willing to do my work here. So here I am and willing to do it. What I run into a lot with people in these realms of having spiritual experiences or non-dual experiences, and I'll just insert here, I have an issue with the word non to describe something that is. It's just a fundamental sort of twist in my being that just doesn't settle well. So I think we need to, all these are terms and constructs and things. Constructs can be helpful and they can be also inhibitory. So anyway, in the nature of my practice, probably much like Judith's, as being a clinician and also doing subtle energy research, I mostly measure people and space as a researcher using subtle energy devices. But in my practice, when people come and they've had some sort of altered experience of themselves, oftentimes if they have not done any of their shadow work, it becomes really difficult to be able to integrate themselves into the real world, or their constructs get shattered if they have a deeply religious background. And so building a bridge to help these people understand exactly what's going on for them is really how I see the job. My personal job is to create a bridge in these domains and in these respects. At the same time, looking for an opportunity to offer an experience, because I think it's the experience that teaches. It's not the literature is very important, but it's ultimately not usually the aha that happens from reading a scientific paper. I get lots of ahas from reading them, but it's not like the awakening, like, the other states that we're talking about in this domain. So that's it for now.
So Judith, do you want to continue?
Continue.
Say a little bit about your process, and then we should open it up to questions.
Yes.
Okay, the realization process. It's a series of practices, of attunement exercises, and it begins with inhabiting the body, which is a real shift from being aware of the body, from that top-down aware. It's really entering into the body. And we find that when we enter into the body, we can then find the space outside the body and feel that the space inside and outside is the same continuous space. It pervades us. When we experience that, it's really not that difficult to experience. Let me say right off that these attunement exercises are not the realization itself, but because the fundamental consciousness is what the Buddhists call self-arising. There's no construction in it. It just arises on its own when we reach a certain degree of openness. However, those practices that say, oh, well, this is your true nature, you just need to relax and be that, doesn't quite do it for me, since I've known many relaxed people who aren't anywhere near this subtlety. So we need to let go of ourselves, not from the surface of ourselves. We need to let go from deep within our core in order to actually land in this dimension of fundamental consciousness that pervades inside and out. So these initial practices in the realization process help us do that, to make deep inward contact with our own body and our own being, and to find the qualities, the essential qualities of our being within, our love, our power, our intelligence, so forth, and then to let go into this very, very subtle dimension of consciousness. And then we find that we experience it as a spaciousness. It's often called space, but it's not really space, it's consciousness. We experience it as somewhat luminous, which goes a long way to healing chronic depression. It's very hard to continue to feel depressed when you feel that you and your world are made of light, subtle light, and a little bit of bliss mixed in there, sense of well-being. And that's the nature of that field. So that's one important aspect of the work. It's inhabiting the body and opening to that pervasive space. We also have relational practices that go right with it. And I wondered if we can do one in about half a minute. Would you like to do that?
Yes.
Do you know where your heart chakra is? Yeah, most of you do, right? First let's do a little grounding first. Just feel that you're in your feet. Come inhabit your feet. And that means really entering into them, feeling that you're present right there in your feet. Yeah, you feel how that's different than being aware of the feet. You're in there. And now take a moment to feel that you're in your whole body. The actual practices go much more slowly than this, but I just want to have a sense of inner contact before we do this small experiment. Right? So there you are sitting in your whole body. It's like if we say the body is the temple, you're sitting inside the temple and breathing. Right? Inside the temple of the body and breathing. Now find your heart chakra. It's in the center of your chest, but deep in the core of your body, and that means inward. So we're focusing inwardly towards the spine as deeply as you can without strain. Now, if you feel comfortable to do this, staying in your own heart chakra without moving at all from there, find the other heart chakras in the room. And if that feels daunting, just find the heart chakra of the person sitting next to you, but don't leave your own body for that. Each of our core points, each of our centers, touches the center of every other being, every other human being, every other being. Yes, so some of you are feeling that. So we're actually one. It's a very interesting thing. Yeah. So we have a series of relational exercises because we first created this self-other dichotomy, the protective dichotomy of self and other in relation to other human beings from our earliest days, right, from early childhood. So we can meditate and feel very, very lovely on our meditation cushion at home and then go outside and see another human being and boom, we're back in the divided space. So in this work, we go right away into a series of relational practices as well. Okay? And then I'll just say one more last thing, and that is that there's also an aspect of the work, the realization process, where we actually go into the constrictions, and I'll talk more about this on Sunday, in my presentation on Sunday. We actually can go into this constrictions as fundamental consciousness, using that very subtle attunement to ourselves to find the way we organized ourselves as children and release those and thus be able to inhabit ourselves more fully and let go more fully into fundamental consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I'm trying to recollect my thinking process now from your exercise. So I want to touch on another piece that I mentioned initially, and that is that part of our efforts to appreciate and develop research on non-dual awareness, we're approaching it from the Ayurvedic system. And the reason is because things such as panchakarma, which are intensive interventions within that medical system, which is clearly a mind, body, spirit system, focuses on the body itself while simultaneously the spiritual nature of the person. And it's this program that we found very dramatically activated this sense of non-dual awareness in the individual. And per what Judith was hinting at earlier, you know, as many of you know, it coincides with a dissolution of the person's existing sense of self as they knew it, at least initially, superficially. If they identify with I am, you know, a physician, or I am a scientist, or I am this, these kind of relational identities in terms of occupation begin to dissolve. And this is what we found in our research project with just a week or so of this intervention that just lasted over time. And they had much greater sense of connectivity to the world around them, to the individuals, and beyond. So this is the initial phase of our project, which, as Deepak said, we're digging deeply into metabolomics and our RNA expression, and Zoran's work is focused on the brain, but we're going to collaborate on this next project to more comprehensively assess as much of the physical molecular aspects of the body. How does the body attune itself and wake up and reflect this new way of being in terms of knowing the nature of the self? So this is a focus of our work at the moment.
Perhaps I should add that there are other people who maybe not published in the peer-reviewed journals that we go on PubMed, but they have papers that are available on non-symbolic awareness or least phenomenal. And some of the things that they show, and that one is from Jeffrey
Martin.
Jeffrey
Yes.
Martin. One of the things that they show is the shift in the following areas. One is a shift in identity from provisional identity to fundamental identity, number one. Number two, emotions more in the direction of love, compassion, joy, equanimity, peace. Number three, in some cases, loss of the fear of death. Number four, not burdened by memory, but having better memory. In the yogic literature, there's a sutra, and the Shiva Sutras, I use memories, but I don't allow memories to use me. So there's sharpness of memory, but there's no baggage or burden of memory. What else? There's this equanimity that you're not flustered by the ups and downs of everyday experience, because you don't identify so much with the experience, but the source of the experience. And there are a few other things that have to do with just feeling connected. But there is literature on this, maybe not published in the kinds of journals that we're talking about.
Yes. And I think related to what you were saying, my mind goes to the default mode network that I'm hoping Zoran can comment on. And this is basically a part of our brain system that goes into rumination, where we just think the same repetitive thoughts, which might have to do with some aspect of our identity, et cetera. But generally, it's not conducive to health and well-being. And Zoran, have you identified and worked with this in your research with Judith?
Right, yes. So default mode network, the so-called default mode network, are the areas in the brain that are self-related, but actually are much more than that. I think that default mode network has definitely doing one of the functions, or not doing them so well, as Paul is saying, in that when certain parts of it are overactive, it's always working with other areas as well, but in particularly these medial prefrontal areas, which have to do with the processes of evaluation and self-evaluation. And we find that they generally tend to be overactive in not necessarily helpful ways. So especially, for example, in depression, there's a signature of kind of a ruminative negative thinking that has to do with overactivity or overuse of some of these networks. You can think of it in terms of the brain settling into a kind of attractor state, and it can get itself out of certain dynamic state that it falls into. However, default mode network really is a kind of a miraculous evolutionary thing in the brain, because it does also many other things that are essential to who we are as human beings. So it has actually a very significant role, very much what we think of ourselves is unique about us has to do with default mode network. And this is because of what brain is to the organism. Brain is essentially an internal controller, or something that internally regulates the state of the body. So it tracks and maps the state of the body, and through various interactions with the body optimizes all the different systems. And then we have involved a large part of the brain that is not processing and optimizing perception, not processing and optimizing motor function or internal body function, is processing and optimizing itself. Right? And so some biologists think that because of that internal development of ability to monitor itself, we have created a biological basis to feel conscious, to feel that I know what is happening right now. And not only that I know what is happening right now, right? The dog has some consciousness, but I know that I know, which is a beginning of approaching to that awareness. So one way that we can get to that fundamental aspect of ourselves is through recognizing that we are aware, abiding in that recognition until the awareness itself wakes up. That fundamental level of consciousness wakes up and recognizes itself. right? So we can have a conceptual thought. I'm conscious. I have read all these things about spiritual things. I know I have this part of myself that's awareness, and I have some sense of awareness. So that's good on the way there. But then at some point there is like a fundamental shift, and what I think and what other people would say that brain can do is that there is a network ignition. A network that's potential inside us. It involves the key nodes of default network and the key nodes of the extrinsic systems. It turns on. And subjectively, for centuries, this has been described like the light goes on inside your head. Suddenly, you wake up, right? That consciousness inside you wakes up to itself. And so that's one thing that where default mode network is really significant in a positive way, right? As, of course, there is other aspects where it becomes disordered, as brain is just an organ in the body, it can be disordered for all kinds of reasons. Default mode network can be also disordered, right?
I have a question, Zoran, which has kind of intrigued me for a while now, ever since all this literature on the default mode network came out. Do other species, other mammals, for example, have this default mode network, and what is it for? Why did it evolve? And is it any different than us, or has that even been studied?
So I would say that biologists have studied that, and there's some evidence that particularly in the higher type of primates, there is something similar. There is a similar type of dynamics, but nothing like we have. There is a very well-known biologist, very highly regarded as a neuroscientist, who has come up with an interesting biological theory, so nothing about us as a consciousness, of what happened to us. And when we look at the enlargement of the mammal brain from the small mammals to monkeys, from little monkeys to big monkeys and so on, we see a gradual increase in the brain size. But then between, let's say, chimps and us, something unusual happens. Our brain is, of course, larger, but it's not larger just by increasing its size. Some areas have actually shrunk relative to the size of the brain. So our perceptual and motor systems relative to the total size of our brain have shrunk. But other areas which are, they used to call them associative, they don't have enormously expanded. And one of those areas most significantly expanding is default mode network. And I speculate that this had to do with the fact that humans have become, something has changed in us as a species, and at some point we woke up. I don't want to say we became conscious, but to put it simply, something like that. So, and then I don't know if you were getting at the other point, which is more of a metaphysical question, whether the brain itself is consciousness or whether consciousness is something that the brain registers. So that's not a question that current neuroscience can answer unless some experiments are set up very specifically to answer that.
One more question,
Yes,
if I may.
I have one, and Tiff has one.
Because you don't get this opportunity frequently. One of the things I've always been intrigued by since a medical student was that the brain cannot feel pain, right? You put a knife through the brain, it cannot feel pain. Now, pain is a form of experience that brings us, in a sense, to ourselves, who or what is experiencing this pain. What do you think is the reason why the brain, which is experiencing everything else, can't experience itself?
So that's right. That's a question that many neurophysiologists are wondering. So if anyone of you has a migraine, right? So you know that you can have a pain inside your head, but the pain is coming from the blood vessels in your head, which do have pain receptors, but brain doesn't. right? And you have all seen those fantastic brain surgeries where the patient is completely awake and can communicate with doctor and even sing opera, while they're having brain surgery. It is thought that the brain would needs to be free from that level of interference with its own functioning in order to more accurately monitor and represent both the body and itself. But as far as I know, nobody knows the answer to this. So.
Well, good to know.
So
I think we
question.
should, yeah.
One more question related to this, and Tiff. So Zoran, this might be related to what you were just speaking about, but so as you know, when people wake up into non-dual awareness, one of the characteristic features is a massive reduction in the amount of background thinking, right? The amount of background thoughts, reduction of 80, 90%, such that the person feels there's hardly any thinking going on at all. So do you have a sense and insight into what is going on in the brain as we know it related to that?
Yeah, I think that we have, so my personal feeling about this is that we actually have two very different ways of knowing and being that are simultaneously occurring. One is the one that we are used to, which is based on a conceptual representational processing in the brain. So the brain can use the concepts, it can use the symbols like words, images, and numbers, and so on, and build the models or representations. Currently, neuroscience mostly understands only that part of our brain functioning. There is some understanding of kind of a preconceptual child mind, like the way toddlers are before they acquire conceptual processing, but we acquire conceptual processing, it develops from very early on. The earliest types of concepts are nonverbal. For example, something is in front of something is down, something is up, right? So the baby, as it's experiencing its world, it's developing these very basic propositional concepts or propositional beliefs. From the contemplative traditions, we know that there is the other way of experiencing with awareness, with this fundamental consciousness. And that level of experiencing doesn't depend on concepts. And if we are to trust people who are more deeply realized, in this level, we don't even have a propositional concept. I used to have a Tibetan teacher years ago, and one of his favorite things was we would like sit on the floor and talk, and then he would take a book and he would drop it, and then he would look at me and say, "You believe it fell down?" And I would think like, "What? Well, it didn't even fall up. It doesn't go up." So he would drop it again and say, "You believe it falls down?" But what he was saying is he was trying to point to that very, very deep level of constructed mind that assumes this is how things are. It doesn't mean that the book is going to go up, but awareness, fundamental awareness, doesn't even have that concept. From the viewpoint of awareness, when the book goes down, you could say the book went down, the book went up, the went sideways, doesn't matter, because it doesn't actually operate on that level. So we have that aspect within ourselves. We don't know very much about it. I think that there are definitely areas in the brain and the cells, synapses, that are processing this. And at the same time, when this awareness is stabilized, which is very interesting, you can have experience when the conceptual parts or the synapses and neurons that do the conceptual thing quiet down. But when the awareness is stabilized, conceptual mind can also be working, does not obscure awareness. Just, the famous metaphor is just as right now there is a space in this room, and the fact that all of us are here in this space doesn't in any way damages the space. Right? The space didn't get damaged, it didn't it disappeared. No, it's here, just perfectly fine. So same way, our conceptual mind can work, and this awareness can be context for all experience. So in that sense, this is why it's very liberating, right? So you don't have to make yourself a certain way.
I just
I
want
want to add something. Go ahead.
The women are on this. Yeah, I think it's very important because there is a kind of mythology growing up about non-dual experience that says we don't feel, we don't think anymore, and that's just simply not true. Just as Zoran was saying, once we know ourselves as fundamental consciousness, although that extra, as Deepak was saying, that extra wallop of childhood pain dissipates and the tape loops dissipate, we do get to a fluidity of thought and emotional responsiveness even more deeply, even more creatively than ever before. So it's not at all, even though we experience fundamental consciousness as stillness, it's not in any way a holding still. Right? It's a freedom.
Agreed. And let me just add real quickly, one theory to think about with this default mode network getting larger is if we think about awareness as neutral and we're becoming aware to the things that we're not asleep to anymore, and these things, these elements get turned on, how our parents did things, how we do things, how our decision processes get made, etc. What I'm finding evidence of in my private practice is that as awareness, as the ahas happen, oh, that's where that came from. Oh, that's that piece. Oh, this is related to decisions I made. Oh, this is related to decisions that my parents made. Or this is in environmental conditions. Or it's all conditional based that we become aware to first, and then we get to access the ability to make change. Therein lies the ability to also get off the karmic wheel.
Okay, can I thank you? I have one more question, Zoran, and then we are done. Okay, so this is an important question. These things bother me a lot, So again, this goes back to medical school. I read an experiment by these two guys, Hubel and Wiesel, who get the Nobel Prize. But the experiment, basically, I'm going to try and give you as much of the background as possible. There are these two groups of kittens, and one group of kittens is brought up in a room that has only horizontal stripes. The other group of kittens is brought up in a room that has vertical stripes, and then they grow up, and when they're cats, one group of cats can't see a horizontal world, the other group of cats can't see a vertical world. So one group of cats will bump into furniture legs, for example, because they can't see them. And when their neural networks are looked at, they don't have the connections to see that thing. So my question is human perception a learned phenomenon that has recycled constructs for thousands of years? Have we created this experience that we are perceiving right now of our body, of this microphone, this room, of stars, galaxies? Is this a learned phenomenon?
So we definitely have this experience because we're human. And our human brain has evolved over the millions of years. And we have also developed relatively normally because during the key moments in development, we had a necessary environmental input so that the neurons that were developing were able to go to places where they need to go and make connections with other neurons. So this is, of course, a huge debate in sciences, whether actually our capacities are innate and whether they're constructed. In other words, whether we have innate capacities, whether it's all just learning. I would say that both. We have innate capacities, but at a certain critical moments in development, we need to be exposed to the right environment, or these capacities are not going to develop. Our individual brain is not going to develop. Now, our experience of this room is definitely made from learned processes. We can have a different experience of the room if some of these processes are unlearned. But even in the fundamental consciousness or awareness, some processes will operate, right? Now, what is the relationship between reality, experience, and knowledge? That is between the ontology, phenomenology, and epistemics. people have been arguing for like 3,000 years. Like as far back as we have a literature, people have been arguing about it. And there's every possible variation on that theme. Personally, I'm realist. If I close my eyes, this room is going to disappear, but it disappears in my experience. It doesn't actually disappear, right? There is some reality to the room, even though there is variation in experience. I have experience of this room. Deepak has experience of this room. Each one of you has a different experience of this room, even though there is one room that we're all in. So that's my personal belief.
Okay, I'll just stop after this because I'm not a realist. I'm not a scientific realist. I'm not a whatever you call it. I'm
Spiritual
not a
idealist.
So yes, I think this is a dreamscape. But anyway,
Yeah, so we have about 10
Now,
minutes
let's
for
open
questions.
please stand up, ask the question, and ask. Please also say who it's addressed to, and please make it a question.
Well, it's not a question, so do you not want it?
Well, if we can do it very...
It's very related.
Okay.
When you were talking about the evoked potential research, I did that research also at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, but we added the heart when we did it, and we found that when brains were synchronized, it was when the hearts were in a 0.1 hertz heart rate variability ratio, and what's associated with the carrying state.
Please recruit her also for the study.
These are great results, and we just need to have them replicated at a large scale.
And I don't think they have been replicated, and that's why I'm speaking.
That's the
it.
catch.
I would love to see them replicated.
Yes.
And
Thank you. Thank you.
in addition to that, the heart showed some presentience with the evoked potential too.
It shows what?
Some presentience
Sentience.
at a
Sentient.
distance.
Okay.
It knew, the heart registered before the brain did that something was going to come
Right.
on.
Well, the heart has neurons, right, too?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for that comment. And please do talk to Paul. We'd love to engage you.
So the question is to the whole panel. It seems like, through non-duality, I hear that a new species is evolving, at least a new kind of humanity is evolving. The more people are conscious and the more people are awakening. But the path to non-duality seems to be very expensive. I mean, almost all the, kind of week-long things are 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. How can you make it accessible to a common person like me?
So what we're doing is, and this is exactly what we're trying to address, because even to come to this conference is very expensive, right? You have to take a flight, you have to come here, get a room, etc. I think digital learning is on its way, and that's what it's all going to be. And it's going to be more effective. In fact, we have found that our digital offerings have more impact than our live offerings. Not that we can get away from the live offerings, because this is an amazing experience too. But that's the only way to expand it. But otherwise, you have to pay for food, employees, rent, mortgage, all of that, insurance.
This is directed to Deepak. You wrote Ageless Body, Timeless Mind about 25 years ago, I think. And Dan Siegel was talking yesterday about you live in two worlds, the Newtonian realm, as you're a swimmer above the water, and then the quantum world sort of below, and that you're existing and you're, as a swimmer, you come up and down. How do you see the most sort of effective way to use those two realms to maximize your...
You said it in the beginning, transcendence and immanence, to be in the world and not of it. That you can engage and be detached at the same time.
And so is that specifically like the mindful meditation to...
I think everybody relates differently. So right now we're looking at contemplative meditation, what is called self-inquiry, Atma Darshan, self-awareness, lot of reflective meditations, but then mindful awareness of perceptual experience of the body, of the viscera, of mental space, of the web of relationship, of awareness itself, awareness of awareness. So people relate to different things. Some people are happy with transcending with a mantra. I think every discipline should be looked at very carefully. But then there's a lot of spiritual traditions. There's a wealth of data and information on these techniques.
Do any of you know if there's any biofeedback equipment that, or anything that has to do with brainwave work or sound or anything else that trains us to go into the non-dual state?
You two should answer this question, but short answer is yes. But go ahead, Zoran. She's talking about technology, biofeedback, bioregulation.
So there are definitely many applications like that. I would say that they're mostly directed towards beginning stages because of how much we're able to determine the signatures of non-duality. So calming down, becoming absorbed, and certain stages of relaxation, these can be trained easily. I think that we're seeing some early indicators of what happens in the brain when there is realized non-dual awareness. But the signature, I think it's still too complex for it to make a device, although some people are working on it.
But looking at the default network should be a promising venue.
Right. So one of the colleague of mine at Yale has done a signature of one of the nodes, one of the areas in the default network called the posterior cingulate cortex, and it decreases in some of these states of meditations. However, difficulty with selecting one area, whether it's in a default mode network, whether it's in a prefrontal area, like a prefrontal alpha or something like that, is that measures that are that coarse are non-specific, right? So that that area of default mode network goes down every time you pay attention to something and you're doing some task. So if I bend down to tie my shoelaces, my PCC goes down. It doesn't mean I'm in non-dual awareness. It just means I'm doing some task. Right? This is the challenge. So I think that the signature is going to be, yes, that's going to be happening, and a whole bunch of other areas are going to be happening in a very kind of a organized dance, and that signature has to be specified, and it's going to be a little bit different for each one of us, right? So that we need to have a gadget where that can actually take our own specific version of that signature and then work with that.
I just wanted to make a quick comment, which is for you guys, somebody in your group to hook up with some people doing research on entheogenic brain waves and what happens to the default mode network, such as Michael Villanueva in San Diego.
I think we have time for 2 questions.
Yeah. I was wondering, first I want to thank the panel for just an outstanding presentation.
Can you put the mic very close?
No, just right to your face. Yeah.
Thank you for the outstanding presentation.
Ice cream cone, like an ice cream cone.
Yeah,
like that?
You got it.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you again. I was wondering with regard to the state of ground consciousness, and this is going to anybody on the panel, that it appears that, there are a number of teachers here that say this can be achieved within a week or two. I've heard this from a couple of teachers. And I'm a little bit confused in the sense that if I've worked in the Tibetan Buddhist group for 25 years and certainly with the mystical Christian group for a while, and it certainly took a lot longer. And I didn't know whether this level of consciousness that you're describing can be achieved in that short a time, other than just momentary glimpses, which I think could be. But it just seems like we're looking at other models where people are really like introduced to Mahamudra, Dzogchen, and other pathways that are really taking many years. So there's a disparity, and I wondered if you'd comment.
I would say it's a bell-shaped curve experience.
Bell-shaped curve.
Couple quick.
There are all kinds of, depends. It depends on the person.
Okay, couple quick comments. There are devices to stimulate the God spot in the brain, and there's a recent Yale University study that has pinpointed the region, temporoparietal junction. Michael Persinger was exploring this with his God helmet 25 years ago. So, but there's now new technology, including ultrasound, and I know some of the people doing that. I've done the EEG research on DMT before Michael Villanueva, and I've published some of it. I'd be happy to share all that. I have a question. Back to the default mode network. So psychedelics, meditation, and the psychedelics include psilocybin, they include ayahuasca, DMT, we're about to know. They're doing a study in London right now. All dial down the activity of the default mode network. So can you, and that is believed to be the ego-embedded consciousness. Do you like that definition, that term?
I think that's one of the things the default mode network does, right?
Not the principal thing?
Well, what is principal, right?
Because
it's principal under normal circumstances, because we all ordinarily live in the constructed consciousness.
When you deconstruct that with psychedelics, then you lose your ego awareness, your identity. That's the correlation, you see.
Right. So that's one of the signatures. There's a couple of things that happen there. So one is that decrease in the, let's call it excessive self-related activity.
Yeah.
Psychedelics also induce certain degree of disorganization, which is not that great, right? Because if you were tripping all the time, it will be more like a psychosis.
Oh, sure.
So in non-dual realization, the internal integrity of the networks doesn't get distorted, and they remain integrated internally. The relationship changes. So yes, decrease in unnecessary default activity, yes. Increase in the functional integration between the nodes of default network and the nodes of other networks.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, this is the question. When young children are developing their ego structures, have they done fMRI studies of the default network? I bet somebody's put a baby into a
Yeah, I think they have probably, yes.
And they have a default mode network that's developing?
I think the relationship between the networks, that's how we established that there is a network, because we're looking at where activity is correlated and anti-correlated. It's relatively innate in the brain, because it also is the underlying physiological organization of the brain. It's how the brain maintains itself.
Well, thank you very much. Thank the panel. Thank you for participating. Very grateful that you came. Thank you.